Beloveds, I invite you now to find your feet on the ground. If you can, you might even move outside for this portion of the service, especially if you are connecting remotely. Find your feet on the ground and find the earth. Even if it is through the floorboards of your home, through the units of the apartment or the basement below. Depending on where you are in Oregon, this morning it may be cool and wet, or it may be warm and dry. Relish and remember the beautiful diversity of the landscape here in Oregon, and your siblings touching down with you across our synod on this earth this morning. And now, remember all of the feet that have found the earth below you. All of the peoples that have met their earth with this earth through the generations. Communities upon communities. I have learned from my Indigenous siblings this practice of land acknowledgement. I confess that I have not attended to this practice often or enough. This is the practice of remembering, calling forth the collective memory that we are not the first feet to touch and steward this ground, this sacred earth, not even close. In fact, if we are not Indigenous, we are on stolen land. My feet touches the earth and makes her home and life with her family in what is known today as East Portland, on the land of the Multnomah tribe of the Chinookan people. I remember today their beloved feet and all the feet of those who have come after them, most often carrying the weight of complexity, the both and of oppressor and oppressed. This weekend, it feels particularly important to touch this earth and attend to the stories, those told and left untold. This weekend, we light fireworks in celebration of a birth of a nation, independence won in blood from empire, and if that is where the story ends, we have only told at most a sliver of the story. We have neglected the eradication of the tribes, the bodies, hearts, lives, family, children, homes from their land for the freedom of white men. Remember, that is all who won freedom that day. Remember who did not. We have neglected the stealing, objectification, enslavement of Black bodies, hearts, lives, the desolation of families, children, home, of Indigenous African people, on which the white wealth of this country was built. Our country enslaved Black beloveds for 89 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. And what follows is our shared history of no repair, no repayment of debt, and in fact, policy after policy that afforded white families benefit while stripping Black and brown families of land, wealth, and freedoms. What happens, beloveds, when only part of the story is told or heard? What happens when parts are ignored and those who would tell them are silenced? And what is possible when we remember together? What happens when we start to listen? Shame and Courage researcher Brené Brown's founded wisdom aligns with recovery wisdom, aligns with Jesus wisdom. She writes, when we deny the story, it defines us. When we own the story, we can write a brave new ending. This morning in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is agitated. He is like a lawyer in a courtroom making closing arguments. To what will I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplace. This language in the ancient world conjures up a courtroom scenario, and Jesus' point is that the people have lost their minds, are being played, and are like children, read immature, impressionable, now playing a ridiculous judge. On one hand, they indict John the Baptist for his fasting, his ascetic, simple lifestyle. He has a demon, they say. He's weird, an outcast. And then, turning to Jesus, they indict him for his eating and drinking. They cry, "Look, a glutton and a drunkard. You don't eat, there's something wrong with you. You eat, there's something wrong with you." As someone who struggled with an eating disorder in her early 20s, this feels familiar. You don't eat, you are sick, feel ashamed. You eat, you're supposed to be skinny, feel ashamed. There is actually no room for a whole human being in this scenario, which reveals that the scenario is bunk, and those doing the judging are bunk too. But let us get back to the gospel. The people, in their immature, irrational judgment, have aligned themselves with those in power, those that judge arbitrarily, without mercy, and oppress. You are poor, sick, foreigner, other, read too brown, too black, too queer, or hang out with that crowd, and we call that bad. Not because it actually has anything to do with virtue, but because it controls the narrative and allows many people to be deemed bad, and a very certain subset of the population to be deemed good and maintain control. Only the early communities in the way of Jesus, listening in, would have heard this indictment of Jesus eating and drinking and immediately caught a memory, remembered into Jesus' meal. And what were Jesus' meals? A motley crew of sinners and tax collectors, women hungry, the rich and the despised, those cast out, all around the same table and picnic blankets. They would have heard themselves, those dismembered parts of themselves, called into that meal, all the parts together at the table. And they would have experienced a bodily memory of wholeness and hope, the beginning of a new story. You see, whatever part of ourselves or the world that we or the world would divorce, neglect, or erase, cut off, that's the line that Jesus transgresses every time to spread out the blanket, to set the table, and make a meal of life there. Broken, yes, and shared. Healing on the menu, truth on the menu, wholeness on the menu, joy on the menu. Perhaps that is the reason for what feels like a turn in Jesus' affect and posture in the gospel this morning. He moves from what feels like anger to one of tenderness, from frustration with childishness to calling his disciples infants. A gracious invitation to recline, rest, for this way of Jesus, this way of remembering, of centering the margins, yours, ours, the world, is good. And yes, that burden is burden. It's in tension with the false binaries of the world that we navigate every day. But when you are together at the margins, you find yourself there with the whole world. You carry that burden together and it becomes light. When the margins become the center, nothing is left out. All is included, and we are made whole. Perhaps Jesus' anger with the people in their judgment is actually grief, as they unremember the fullness of their stories, align themselves with power, divorcing parts of themselves, parts of their communities, parts of God's blessed creation. Jesus grieves that they are missing out on the sweet and savory of the party that they are invited to. Literally, that they are already in the midst of, blanket thrown, table set, but cannot see, cannot hear. Beloveds, as I sit today My feet feel heavy on the earth. If I am honest, part of me wants to unremember and go back to planting my garden and watching my children play. There are parts of my story, our story, that I am ashamed of, that I wonder, can they also belong? But freedom that shackles the other is no freedom at all. Because if I do that, I am also unremembering a part of me, a part of my own story, and a part of my children's story. I am dismembering myself as I continue to participate in the dismembering of my Black, Brown, and Indigenous siblings in this amnesia. And dismembering the possibility of a future where I get to be whole, and so does my beloved neighbor, my sibling, where payment of debt, repair, truth-telling, healness and wholeness, and true liberation are the brave new chapter. Beloveds, whatever part of your story that the world would silence, whatever part of our collective story we are told to forget, there, precisely there, Jesus spreads the blanket, sets the table, and with his body and our bodies, we start to tell the whole story. The whole story of belovedness and crucifixion and remembering and new life. Beloveds, as we gather around bread and wine as the church, as the communities of Jesus today, what would it be like to hear ourselves into that motley meal and the promises of that table with no last seat, and into that freedom to find our feet on the ground and remember the whole story, listening to the cries of those among us long silenced, putting us back together? What repair might we as the church be called to in these times? What might truth-telling look like? What might healing look like? What might wholeness feel like? What might this banquet of new life taste like? Blanket spread, table set. Beloveds in Southern Oregon, I invite you to find your feet on the ground and remember the Latgawa tribe. In Central Oregon, find your feet on the ground and remember the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiutes. Eastern Oregon, find your feet on the ground and remember the Walla, Cayuse, the Umatilla. And Coast, find your feet on the ground and remember the Susla and the Kalawatset. Mid-Willamette Valley, find your feet on the ground and remember the Kalapuya. Amen, amen, amen. May it be so. Amen.